Joining me now is the Washington Post opinion writer Jennifer Rubin. She's also an MSNBC political analyst. She's the host of the podcast Jen Rubin's Green Room and the author of the book Resistance: How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. Also with us is Norm Ornstein. He's a senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's the co-host of the Words Matter podcast. Good morning to both of you. Thank you for being here for what is becoming a regular segment for the three of us on the dysfunction in Congress. Jen, let me start with you. There's a new poll out this morning by the New York Times and Siena College. It shows that in a hypothetical head-to-head between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, Trump is leading in 5 of the 6 battleground states where they polled registered voters. I guess we have to say we're a year out from the election, but does this surprise you, and what factors do you think are in play here that helped Trump pull ahead?
I really don't take it all that seriously. To get into the weeds just a little bit, nearly a quarter of the voters in this poll didn't vote last time, which suggests they pulled up a lot of registered but unlikely voters. There are also some numbers that just make no sense. I have seen nowhere where Donald Trump, for example, is trailing Biden by only 1 point with youngest voters. So I think these polls are sort of catnip for the New York Times and for other organizations. I like to go back to the same period of time in the Obama administration, in other administrations, and the president was going to be a one-term president. It was hopeless, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's a data point, not a very important one. And as you point out, a year from now, we are going to be in a very different landscape.
Right. And Norm, we're in a wild news cycle where literally day to day and hour to hour things change. You're right. We put these things up as data points because it's not for us to not tell our viewers that this is the case. But I would agree the weight on it is something our viewers have to decide for themselves. I would ask you, though, are we operating in 2 worlds where there's sort of Donald Trump and what he's doing and Congress and what they're doing? Or are the two going to come together at some point and show voters what this complete dysfunction of the Republican Party looks like right now? Donald Trump and his legal travails and Congress and its, I don't know, every kind of travails.
I think that will happen, Ali. And one of the things that I think is clear here is that most voters have paid no or little attention to Donald Trump's legal problems. That will change when we get criminal trials, and especially if and when we get convictions. And at the same time, while lots will happen and change over the course of the next year, when we get down to 2 choices and we have one presidential candidate who is for a complete Muslim ban, who has supported and lunched with Nazis or neo-Nazis, and who has criminal convictions, and we have issues like the post-Dobbs world and abortion, as you were just discussing with David Pepper, that will reemerge when we see clear choices. I think we'll find a different dynamic. But that's not to sugarcoat a series of polls that show that for reasons that we will have to explore for many years, a president who's had astonishing success in many areas, including the economy, been as masterful as possible in foreign policy, even as the world is falling apart, has such low standing with the public. And that includes on empathy and on personal likability, which is really his greatest strength.
Jen, over the past few weeks, we have seen the war between Israel and Hamas split some factions of the Democratic Party. What's your sense of how Democrats manage this? Is this a short-term matter? Is it something that Biden can repair? Is it going to repair itself? What's your sense of it?
Well, I think the vast majority of Americans and the vast majority of Democrats are supportive of 2 things. One, Israel's right to defend itself, and 2, a 2-state solution. I think so long as Biden maintains his position on both of them, that Israel has a right to defend itself within the laws of war, and we have to make a much bigger push after the fighting stops to resolve the Palestinian issue, that he will essentially hold the Democratic coalition together. I have to go back to an adage, however, and that is people rarely vote on foreign policy in a presidential election. Could this be problematic for Biden? Yes, but I wouldn't get too exercised until we see that there's some really serious issue within the Democratic Party, as opposed to a lot of action in the street by people who may or may not be voters, may or may not be registered, may or may not be likely voters. Biden, to underscore Norm's point, has really handled this in the most masterful way possible, not allowing extremists on either side to really divert him or push him down a road that's going to be dangerous for Israel and insoluble for the Palestinians.
Norm, let's talk about Mike Johnson. I mean, it was wild. I was in Israel when this was all going down, so I probably wasn't as read in on it as I normally would be. I hadn't really heard about Mike Johnson all that much before, his name was floated for speaker. But like most Americans, we're all learning a little bit more about this. Mike Johnson's only been in Congress for 6 years. He's got some fairly out there views on, outside of the mainstream on abortion and same-sex marriage and LGBTQ rights. He did support the effort to overthrow the 2020 election last week in response to the mass shootings in Maine. When he was asked about gun control, he said, quote, "At the end of the day, the problem is the human heart." I don't know. Does this stuff come back to bite him, or does that just not count for anything anymore in this Republican Party that's in disarray as it is?
I think we're going to find as time passes that many Republicans in the House may regret the choice that they've made. And it's not just his extremist views and religious fundamentalist views. We're learning more about Mike Johnson as a person and his record. For a couple of years, he was the dean of an extremist law school that lost its accreditation. We know now that after he's 51 years old, he had a career as a lawyer, including working for a number of extremist organizations. Part of the reason we know about his views on LGBTQ issues is because of that. But he had other clients. And he says that he has no assets, no bank account. He's been in Congress for 6 years, making, what most Americans would see as a pretty nice sum of money. There's something really screwy about this, and a guy who's not going to come under great scrutiny when he's in a safe seat in Louisiana and is a backbencher. But I think we're going to find a lot more about him that suggests to me that his tenure as Speaker might be quite a short one. Then we're going to get back to not just his own views, but the fact that they reflect a Republican Party in the House where the lunatic fringe is a majority right now. And its inability to govern, its unwillingness to even consider ways of governing, I think will come back to haunt Republicans. Mitch McConnell's desire even to back some of Joe Biden's policies, I think, are because he's scared to death that that will reflect on his Senate candidates. And his goal is to get a majority in the Senate. He doesn't want to be dragged down by the antics in the House.
Yeah, it does sound like that. It sort of sounds like you guys in the House do whatever you need to do. We've got a different thing going on over here in the Senate. Always good to see the two of you. Let's make this a regular thing as we seem to be doing. I'll see you next weekend. Jennifer Rubin, an opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC political analyst, and Dr. Norman Ornstein, a senior fellow emeritus at the American Enterprise Institute and co-host of the podcast Words Matter.